So welcome everyone to Marx 1213. It's a privilege to welcome Columbia University professor Bruno Bosteels, one of the world's leading experts on Marx, to this seminar on Karl Marx's Civil War in France, on the history of the Commune, and the reception of both the text and the Commune itself in the Americas, especially in Latin America and Mexico. We turn then in this session to the penultimate historical period of Marx's life. Not the last, not the late Marx, but the period just before that. With the creation of the First International, the International Working Men's Association in 1864, the rise and fall of the Paris Commune several years later in 1871, and Marx's several addresses to the First International on the Franco-Prussian War, and of course his famous address to the General Council just a few days after the collapse of the Paris Commune, the address that we know as the Civil War in France. What I find so remarkable and inspiring about this text is the way in which Marx uses the model of the Paris Commune to imagine and describe a new political form, right? And in this sense, this is one of the real political texts of Marx. A political form that we might call with him a self-government of the producers. It's a model, of course, with some critiques, but a model, almost a blueprint, resting on assemblies of delegates elected for short durations, paid at workmen's wages, and themselves working. The Commune was to be, as he says, a working, not a parliamentary body, executive and legislative at the same time. And here we have a vision of something with a dramatically reduced role for the central government and really breaking the hold of the illusion, which is what Marx says it is, of an independent or superior state to the people themselves. It's a remarkable text also to me because it's so abolitionist in many ways, not just abolition of property, which is something we can talk about and which is an interesting conversation with Voltairine de Cleyre's piece, but abolitionist of policing and repressive organs of the state. There's this idea that the people would be armed, eliminating the standing army, but also that the police would effectively be abolished. And also for our purposes at this time, here at Columbia University, also a fascinating text for what it says about the university, right? Arguing that universities and educational institutions should be transformed, open to the public for free, and themselves freed from the interference of the state and of the church. You couldn't get anything more contemporary, really. Thus, he writes, not only was education made accessible to all, but science itself freed from the fetters which class prejudice and governmental force had imposed upon it. And so Marx refers to the Commune as a completely, in his words, a completely new historical creation. Something that we can think about, imagine, and explore today at this seminar with Professor Bosteels, who will put Marx's writings on the Commune in conversation with two texts, or more than two texts, but at least two texts that we've read for today, Voltairine de Cleyre's The Commune is Risen, and Plotino Rhodakanaty's The American Commune, as well as in relation to the second part of his book, The Mexican Commune. And he'll contextualize how the Paris Commune and Marx's text, The Civil War in France, can be read together, also with Marx's later work, the late Marx, and Marx's later interest in non-Western commune forms, which I think will push us into archives of non-Western social formations beyond what Marx himself was reading and annotating. Few scholars are as well positioned to propose these readings for us than Bruno Bosteels, who's not only an expert on Marx, but also on the American reception throughout the Americas of Marx's writings. Bruno Bosteels is the Jesse and George Siegel Professor in the Humanities, as well as the Dean of Humanities in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences here at Columbia, and well known to you all. He is the author, translator, or editor of more than a dozen books, and is currently finishing 2 new books, including one called The State and Insurrection, New Interventions in Latin American Marxist Theory. He will also be speaking about his other book on the Commune in Mexico, which will be appearing in English, forthcoming from Duke University Press. So welcome, Bruno, and welcome everyone else to 1213. Join me in welcoming.
Thank you, Bernard, for the invitation for tonight. Also, thank you for keeping this intellectual forum going. I think this is sort of a heroic effort with your team. I think it's sort of surprising that we can still have these type of intense intellectual events on our campus. So I'm extremely grateful for that. I do want to start with a little bit of a caveat or some reservations or a warning. You said expert on Marx. I don't know what that means. So I've written a book on Marx.
That makes you an expert.
Marx and Freud in Latin America and on the actuality of communism. And I want to finish the translation of the Mexican Commune book, and I'm preparing or hoping to finish a book, Philosophies of Defeat, which is sort of a reckoning, a polemical reckoning with European post-Heideggerian philosophy, sort of the dark polemical counterpart to the Mexican Commune. So you could think, very often, does that mean that I'm a Marxist, or what does it mean to be a Marxist today? And if you've read the sort of the provocation of the thesis on Marx, I do think, and this is where my reservation comes in, I'm very pleased that we have like Marx 1313, 13 meetings about all the works of Marx. But I also wanted to point out that there comes a moment when you talk about Marx in the sense that we're actually going against Marx's own orientation, which is the point where instead of looking from Marx outwards to sort of analyze a given situation or a conjuncture, the question subtly sort of turns around and becomes, what does Marx say? What does Marx mean by this or that? How did he shift? And so then the gaze goes sort of inwards and looks to Marx's system and builds some form or other of Marxism. Like it builds an ism from Marx. Now, we all are familiar with the sort of quip that late in his life, when Jules Guesde and his son-in-law, Paul Lafargue, were sort of engaging in what he called revolutionary phrasemongering. Marx said, what is certain is that I am not a Marxist. And that's sort of a silly comment that a lot of people make. Oh, I'm not a Marxist, but I'm not a Marxist, but in following Marx, I am maybe a Marxist. But I do think it's important to sort of come to terms with the fact that Marx had an enormous difficulty finishing books, right? But on the other hand, and this is the Marx that I like, as an orientation or as a method, he wrote to his daughter that he's a machine condemned to devour books and then throw them in a changed form on the dunghill of history. And that's sort of what I like to do today. When I was preparing for this, I was sort of gathering all the books that went into this reading of the Commune from an American perspective or from a Mexican perspective. And all I would like to do is basically bring these books here. There may be 40, 50 books, but I can bet, my money on it that I would say 95% of these books will have been unfamiliar to even specialists or experts in Marx. And that's sort of the situation that I want to diagnose and that I want to address and see if we can do something about it. I'm also thinking there's a little book which, as far as I know, has never been translated by Patrice Leroux, Les Sous-mains de Marx, talking about the crisis of the book, Marx's inability to finish books, and even the finished books are never really finished. And what the machine Marx in devouring and reading books, and how he treats books to pull a theory a critical work from the books that he annotates and comments, and very often just copies, as we will see later on. So this is not a critique of the endeavor of Marx 1313, but I do want to draw our attention to this tension between Marx as a source for a critical and analytical intervention, and Marx as a target of our reading apparatuses that turn him into a source for which basically Marx needs to give us the answer to the problems that we have today. And the question is no longer what should we do today, but rather what does Marx say we should do. And in a sense, Marx's own work is always meant to be both descriptive and prescriptive. So it's an analysis and an intervention. It talks about both the logic of the structures that he analyzes and the history of the interventions or events to which he responds, including the Paris Commune of 1871. That kind of combination, Alain Badiou once joked about, I think it's in Theory of the Subject, that Lenin's title, The Situation and Our Tasks, should be the title of every text in Marxism, in the sense of combining, you know, an analysis of the situation and at the same time a setting out of the tasks for responding to that situation. Now with that caveat, let's go and have a closer look at the Civil War in France, which is Marx's take on the Paris Commune that lasted from March 18 until May 28 in 1871. Now we all are familiar with the famous quotes from the opening pages in his account, in his speech. What is the commune that swings so tantalizing to the bourgeois mind? The secret of it is that it is the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economical emancipation of labor. It is a government of the people, by the people. Now this reading of the Paris Commune has served as a model for subsequent interpretations of revolutionary moments in the Marxist-inspired or communist tradition. For example, in the case of Badiou, you know, he refers to the Soviets as the communes of Petrograd in 1917, and he believes that in that way it is a Paris Commune that is periodizing the October Revolution and vice versa, that the two events need to be connected to one another, and that this is emblematized when Lenin danced in the snow when the Soviet had held power for longer than the 72 days of the Paris Commune. Or in the later text on the Cultural Revolution, Badiou also adds the Shanghai Commune to this long and established tradition. So we definitely have many examples of where the heroic model of the Paris Commune, despite or perhaps because of its crushing defeat, serves as a model in an intermittent history of the rise and resurrection of the Commune. The short text by Voltairine de Cleyre was just like a little teaser. It's very hard to sort of give you access to or give you a reading about the Mexican Commune, which I would like to get to, because we are sort of trapped in a certain paradigmatic understanding of the Paris Commune as this heroic model for subsequent moments, that it is incredibly difficult to think about an understanding of the Commune and communal revolts prior to the Paris Commune. Marx in the Civil War in France also insists that the Paris Commune is emphatically international. Not only would it serve as a model for the rest of France, even including the smallest hamlet, he said, the smallest country hamlets would follow the same rough sketch of national organization, which the Commune had no time to develop, but it is also a fundamentally international phenomenon. This is symbolized by the destruction of the Vendôme column, by bringing in many international militants as part of the international embrace of the communards, including Leo Frankel, who was one of the few true Marxists in the Central Committee of the Paris Commune. But he also insists that it is, or could, or would have become the model for a communal organization in all other countries outside of France, and I quote, "Within sight of the Prussian army that had annexed to Germany 2 French provinces, Alsace and Lorraine, the Commune annexed to France the working people all over the world. Under similar circumstances, it would explode in all countries as it did in France." Now, this international history of the Commune, the sort of the dissemination of the model of the Paris Commune throughout the globe, has been the focus of new histories in the 20th century of the Paris Commune, beginning for the centenary in a massive, like 600-page book in French with collective contributions titled 1971, Jalons pour une histoire de la Commune, markers for a history of the Commune, but also more recently Kristen Ross's book on communal luxury, and a French author whose name will be will remain unmentioned, who also works on the Commune as a traversal of internationalism, unmentioned because he uses my work on the Mexican Commune without mentioning it. So I will not do him the favor of giving him publicity. This was the work of exiled communards, so that gave an international projection to the Paris Commune, and it brought attention to new figures and protagonists, including Elizabeth Dmitriev, Élisée Reclus, William Morris, Peter Kropotkin, and others. So Kristen Ross has dealt with this very eloquently, how it served to provide a model for a universal federation of peoples or a federation of communes. And that also should lead to attention to non-Western countries. But still, you know, including, as she says, in India, Algeria, and Latin America. Still, as indicated by the fact that one of the publishers of the Spanish translation still uses the French tricolore on the cover, it doesn't exactly avoid the sort of chauvinism where this international history emanates from Paris. So it is a international new history of the Paris Commune, but its starting point remains the Paris Commune. And about Latin America, for example, other than Reclus' presence in the Americas, Kristen Ross says very little. The other unnamed author or historian just reviews the reception of the Paris Commune in newspapers in other countries. And we could, of course, continue this by including Mexico in this context. On June 28, 1874, there's a small 4-page newspaper that starts appearing in Mexico City under the title La Comuna, subtitled, and I translated, bi-weekly dedicated to the defense of the radical principles and official organ of proletarianism in Mexico. That lasts for 20 issues. In a speech on the in the first number of this newspaper, La Comuna, there is a speech by an exiled communard who says, as long as there's a man or a woman alive, the commune will continue to exist. Because great principles are immortal and without exotic aids, they manage to push their way through, put an end to the lies, and shine forth like a sun of eternal truth. The commune is alive in France as in Mexico, in the United States as in Germany, in China as in Arabia. But we must come together as people of goodwill to work for the consolidation of our principles, and so on and so forth. It goes on for about 20 more lines, single sentence. From September 24 onwards, it changes its name to La Comuna Mexicana, and now the subtitle reads, Bi-weekly periodical for the defense of the people's oppressed classes, and lasts for another 28 issues. So we can definitely also study the impact of the Paris Commune following the same trajectory of internationalizing the image and portrayal of the Mexican Commune, but it would still be based on the source model of the Paris Commune. In 1877, the other text that I offered for you to read, a fascinating character who is a Greek, Mormon, Spinozist, Fourierist, utopian socialist, Plotino Rhodakanaty, goes to Mexico. At the time, the president had opened up benefits for people who wanted to emigrate to Mexico and start, and give them land. And so a lot of Mormons actually went there at the time, and he was a fervent reader not only of Spinoza but also of Charles Fourier, and he set up a popular school to train young Mexican students, potentially some of the leading thinkers behind the future Mexican Revolution. And he, in this text from 1877, also says that the commune has exploded in America, referring to the railroad strike of 1877 in Erie, in Pennsylvania. He then goes on to say that even though it has been extinguished in Paris, the germ that sprouted the commune in Erie will now pass on to the Mexican region. And he adds with great rhetorical flurry, the greatest fires always begin as a spark that seemingly by chance drops like combustible or penetrates the arsenal of gunpowder, the explosion of which wreaks terrible havoc. The past is in the present. Keep this sort of temporal loop in mind. The past is in the present, just as the present is found wholly in the future. To look carefully and logically to deduce the events of our time is to see the future in advance. This is a common temporal operation of the Fourierists, that in their utopian socialism, they sort of connected the future as a return of a past social formation that would come back in a superior form. In this temporal loop, you of course recognize the same logic that Marx will follow and that was already discussed in the session with Kohei Saito 2 weeks ago in Marx 11:13. Thus, we believe that according to the infallible law of analogy, the commune, which has been extinguished in Paris, at least in appearance, after germinating throughout Europe and transmigrating to the United States, will not fail to visit us in a short while. Now, we're still, if we look at this, we're still thinking about the projection of the Paris Commune, mostly from the outlook of foreigners, in this case, Plotino Rhodakanaty in Mexico, or the exiled communards from France directly. Many of them went to Patagonia, Brazil, Chile. They are part of the dissemination of socialist and communist imaginary in Latin America. And in that book that I mentioned before for the centenary of in 1971, this is part of the topic that is being discussed by Latin American scholars of the Paris Commune. Now, can we, the question is, if we then read subsequent events in Mexico, for example, in 1914, 1915, after they met in Mexico City, Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata left Mexico City after sitting uncomfortably, one of them in the presidential chair. They left Mexico City after 6 days and sort of abandoned the idea of occupying central state power and folded back onto the northern and the southern regions. In the case of the Zapatistas, the first Zapatistas, the Trotskyist historian Adolfo Gili has described what they set up in that 1 year period with radical agrarian reform, probably the most radical agrarian reform in the history, in the 20th century. Communal self-defense, collective decision-making processes following sort of the assembly model, and so on and so forth. Gili calls this a commune, the Morelos Commune. Again, he quotes Marx, of course, he quotes the Civil War in France, so we keep on reproducing the same model. One of his generals, Genaro Amezcua, went to Cuba and he was in charge of PR. For the Zapatistas. This is a fascinating little collection of 1919 with letters, some of them probably apocryphal, of Zapata himself, the famous letter in which he compares the Mexican and the Soviet, the Russian Revolution, but also very early estimations of and evaluations of the Mexican Revolution. In 1919 in Australia, Ellis Bird, I don't know anything more than that, he's the editor of this wonderful little pamphlet called Zapata Land, of how a rebel communist state in present-day Mexico Republic is now bringing together 4 million people, covering an area of more than 95 square miles, equal to Victoria. And they also published some of the same accounts of the so-called communistic or communalist Mexican Revolution under Emiliano Zapata. In Chiapas, the UK collective Aufheben published a little pamphlet using Gillies' model to describe the uprising in 1994 in Chiapas as a commune, question mark, extending it. Again, these seem to be foreign imposed interpretations on events that happen within Mexico, and we are still not moving away from the sort of typical model of dissemination where from the metropolitan center, the radical idea spreads to the peripheries. One of the first times in which explicitly a social movement or uprising called itself the Commune started in 2006, the barricades of Oaxaca, calling itself explicitly, not only despectively, even though some journalists also use the term condescendingly, La Comuna de Oaxaca. So in the book, in the first part, I write sort of a fragmentary history of the commune in Mexico, using some of these examples and studying how they could fit in a broadened view of the Mexican commune. But that still leaves the question of why does this history have to start with the Paris Commune? And what I would like now to do is sort of flip the narrative completely to the point where the Paris Commune will actually turn out to be quite of an epiphenomenon in a long-term, in a long-duration history of comunero revolts that is more than 500 years old, and of which Marx was very aware early on in his journalistic writings of the 1850s in the New York Daily Tribune, and to which he will return, sometimes forgetting that he had annotated the same text in the 1850s in his late writings. Now, Marx was certainly familiar with a different history that does not make it into Jacques Grandjean's, another massive 600-page volume about the history of the vocabulary of communism and communalism prior to the Paris Commune. And he said, his claim, there is no serious reference prior to 1785. Taking the community of goods as a criteria, anything from before, whether it was the medieval communes or some of the Jesuitic reducciones in Latin America that have also been accused condescendingly of being communistic or comunero rebelliousness, do not fit in that history. One of the earliest sort of philosophical texts would be the manuscript in the handwriting of Hölderlin, The Communism of Spirits, that perhaps jointly was written by Hegel, Schelling, and Hölderlin himself, even though the editors of Hölderlin say it's apocryphal in his case. There was a much longer tradition of communal or comunero revolts. And here we have sort of the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous, which is that in 1520, 1521, we have at the same time the uprisings of the comunidades in Castile in Spain, and on the other end of the Atlantic, Hernán Cortés' siege and destruction of Mexico, ancient Mexico City, Tenochtitlan. Again, as I mentioned, Marx was familiar with the history of the comuneros of Castile. In his writings, which were published, he planned to publish 9 articles on revolutionary Spain. He only managed to bring out about 5 of those. But in those journalistic texts of the mid-1850s, he already speaks at length of the 1520, 1521 rebellion against Charles V in Spain. And he mentions their coincidence with the exploits of Hernán Cortés during the conquest of Mexico on the other side of the Atlantic. And Hernán Cortés' endeavor has also been read as a comunero uprising, like his disobedience was interpreted as similar to that of the comunidades in Castilla. Now, in general, as he does also again in the Civil War in France or in the Communist Manifesto, Marx quickly dismisses the uprising of the comuneros, just as he rejects the comparisons with medieval communes in France or Italy in the Communist Manifesto. And he also here, as Bernard mentioned, he says it's an absolutely new, it would be a mistake to compare it to past historical phenomena. That's what he says in the Civil War in France, unlike what he does in the 18th Brumaire, where he takes great delight in pointing out all the theatrical repetition of ancient Roman history. Here, the Commune would be a radical break. It would be incomparable to the medieval communes. And similarly, in different footnotes to the reeditions of the Communist Manifesto, Engels will clarify the use of the expression communes with examples from France or Italy. But since that only sort of takes care of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, it doesn't really serve their purpose, so they do not draw a line of continuity between those experiments and 19th century communism. In that regards, aside from the fact that they don't mention the Spanish-speaking world anymore, an important occasion was lost to connect the discussion with a long tradition of communal revolts and uprisings in the Hispanic transatlantic. Let me just briefly use one example. This is a bilingual or trilingual account in Nahuatl, Spanish, and the pictographic history of the conquest of Mexico, taken care of by the proto-ethnographer, the Franciscan friar Bernardino Sahagún, second half of the 16th century. He translated this text in the 16th century into Christianized, Spanish. But then in the 20th century, Nahua specialists retranslated from the original Nahua. And then we get something like this. This is the massacre in the Templo Mayor in Tlatelolco, where the Spaniards interrupted the festivities for, that were taking place in the temple. Some of the Nahuas attempted to force their way out, but the Spaniards murdered them at the gates. Others climbed the walls, but they could not save themselves. Those who ran into the communal houses were saved there for a while. So were those who lay down among the victims and pretended to be dead. But if they stood up again, the Spaniards sought them and killed them. The term that is here translated is casas comunales, or communal houses. In Nahua is calpulco, the place of the calpulli. Originally, Sahagún translated as the chapels of the pyramids or the cues of the Aztecs. But here we come to, because of course you could only imagine the gathering place where they have their deities, so it must be something similar to a chapel. But we're really talking about the gathering place of this entity that is called the calpulli. And the question then is, how do we translate or think of that? Usually it's translated as parroquia, if you're a Christian, or barrio and vecindad, neighborhood, or sort of a unit of administrative unit. My suggestion is, since we translate communal houses or calpulco by communal houses, to translate or think of calpulli as commune. Now, you'll say, oh, another European imposition of the vocabulary of the Paris Commune, but I hope you are sort of getting that I'm moving towards the point where it's actually going to be the other way around. The Paris Commune is going to be the epiphenomenon of a much longer comunero tradition, of which Marx realized that it was an offspring of this longer tradition. The uprisings of the comunidades also led to the change in meaning. In Spanish, comunidades, one of the meanings in the dictionary is uprisings, levantamientos. So when Don Quixote tells Sancho Panza that he should stop using his popular sayings because one day you're going to be hung for them, because they're going to take away your government, your vassals will rebel against you, y ha de haber entre ellos comunidades. There must be uprisings. This is the articulation that I want to get to. The communal revolt tradition, that is sort of an underground tradition of over 500 years, because it precedes the arrival of Hernán Cortés in Mexico. And what does that do for our understanding of the commune? Now, why is it so difficult to get to this point, to understand this other history, the history of what I call the other commune? Because even some of our most admired friends completely reject this. And I could have quoted Etienne Balibar, I could have quoted Tony Negri, even Tony Negri in some of his latest interviews about communal uprisings in Europe, and they asked him about the late Marx, and he sort of shakes that off and says, there's nothing really interesting. That's sort of Hegelian philosophy of history. We shouldn't really be dabbling in that. And more humoristically, Badiou shakes that off as well as the cult of friendly archaic societies. It's just ridiculous reactive propaganda. It's like where babies, women, men, and old people live fraternally, including with mice, frogs, and bears. I mean, it's funny, but it also means that this other side of the history of the commune is completely out of sight. Now, Emiliano Zapata, in a sense, avant la lettre, answered that and also rejected or dismissed questions about communism. So when they gave him books about anarchism and communism, he would say, you know, I have read your books with great care, and the books that you've given me about communism, but that's not for us to do. These ideas seem good and humane to me, but I must tell you, it's not up to us to put them into practice, but to the new generations and to implement them. Who knows how many years would be needed? So we have a complete missed encounter between the Mexican Revolution, which is accused of being communistic, but does not want to get bogged down into discussions about anarchism or communism, even though some of his ideologues were trained in that school by the Fourierist socialists. And on the other hand, our European friends who are not interested in looking at any of those peripheral forms of communism that they dismiss as primitive communism in a negative sense. I think what we are facing here is a much broader sort of intellectual division of labor between the West and the rest that the translation theorist Naoki Sakai and an old colleague of mine at Cornell talks about, not just between geographical distinctions, but a division that really affects the capacity of forms of knowledge, whereby theory is produced, the self-reflective knowledge about politics, about communism, about history is produced in the West, whereas data and raw materials for thought as objects for study are produced in the rest of the world. So it's sort of a division of humankind in terms of subjective capacities and faculties for producing the intelligibility of our present moment, which we could sort of summarize under the headings of humanitas, man, in the universal man capable of self-reflexive thought in the humanities, and the social sciences, versus anthropos, the object of anthropological gaze onto cultural difference, giving the particularities, empirical data that are the objects of study in that new 19th century discipline that is ethnography and anthropology. This also applies to Marx. This is what I tried to address in the thesis on Marx, that usually when there is a school of Marxism, whether it's heterodox, orthodox, vulgar, structuralist, autonomist, and so on, you pick your text. But there's not just a choice of the young Marx, the late Marx, the middle Marx, the mature Marx. It also has to do with approaches, with the disciplinary framework in which you address the problems that Marx deals with. If you're a philosopher or a political theorist, you usually turn to the Communist Manifesto, to Capital, or the Civil War in France. If you're a historian and anthropologist, particularly in Latin America, your daily bread is to read the ethnological notebooks that nobody in Europe reads. Or look at one particular text. If you want to read the Grundrisse, and you're in Europe or in the English tradition, you typically focus on the introduction or the Einleitung or on the fragment on machines. And you literally skip the parts on forms, economic forms that precede capitalism, which was also published as a little booklet by Hobsbawm. And you also, unless, in the last 10 or 15 years, of course, there's a renewed interest in the late Marx, but you typically also skip the letter and draft of Zazulich. And if you even deal with the ethnological notebooks, it's certainly not about the segment on the Aztec Confederacy. So that allows you to look at different things. You can look at the Paris Commune of 1871 or the Petrograd Soviet of 1917, and you will talk about commune and communard, and you will put these words in French. If you talk about the Hispanic tradition, we're dealing with comunidades, comuneros, and maybe that strange entity that is called the calpulli. There is, of course, a flurry of new work on the late Marx. But what we very often see that is in the Anglo-European tradition, these experts in Marx and Marxology rarely, if ever, look beyond Marx's own texts. So they will give you the history of how Marx ended up writing the ethnological notebooks, but they have no reference point to judge whether anything he says makes sense or whether it's part of a larger discussion in those countries discussed by Marx. We have recently, under the ex-vice president in Bolivia, Álvaro García Linera, new editions of Marx that focus precisely on those manuscripts about la comunidad ancestral, the ancestral community, because it's very difficult to talk about it without using terms that are loaded, like primitive, ancient, and so on, or about colonialism, particularly one notebook from London, 1851, which I'll come back to in a second, or again, nationalism, capitalism, and community. As I mentioned, if you are a historian or anthropologist in Mexico, you have to spend, it's sort of your rite of passage. You have to go through the evaluation of the calpulli. What does that mean? What is that entity? Is it a geographical administrative unit? Is it a relation of kinship? Is it a lineage? Is it a clan structure? What is the social and economic structure of that pre-capitalist formation? The main source in most of these accounts is another Franciscan friar, Alonso de Zorita, and a book that he wrote and prepared at the end of his life, which is called Breve y Sumaria Relación de los Señores de la Nueva España, a brief and summary account of the lords of New Spain. He was an auditor, an oidor. He also made compilations of laws, which I'll come back to in a few minutes. And many of the Franciscan friars were utopian millenarian Christians who believed that the indigenous populations of the New World promised to become better Christians than the old Christians in Europe, who had been contaminated. So we need to take many of their writings with an extra grain of salt, on top of the fact that they are, of course, the ideologues of the endeavor of the conquest. But nonetheless, as part of these utopian millenarian accounts, they looked at the social formations, the types of leadership, the collective land ownership, the social structures, the family and kinship relations, and they gave these proto-ethnographic accounts of how that worked. So still today, this is our main source. Now, this is just one example of what Zorita describes about land ownerships. The lands they possessed were allotments from when they came to the land, and each lineage or group took their pieces or lots and boundaries designated for them and their descendants. And thus they have possessed them to this day, and these bear the name of calpulli. And these lands do not belong to each individual in the neighborhood, but rather to the common ownership of the calpulli. Now, Marx knew about this because in his notebooks from 1851 in London, he is reading William Prescott's The Conquest of Mexico, who in the footnotes adds a French translation of Alonso de Zorita that came out in 1840. Rapport sur les différentes classes de chefs de la Nouvelle Espagne. And he writes, I'm not going to read this, this is typical Babelic, combination of Nawa, English, and German. But he's trying to get to what are this type of land ownership? The same questions that he raises in the Formen, in the forms, the pre-capitalist forms, in the Grundrisse, different forms of collective land ownership and communal being, or Gemeinwesen. The laws regulating these matters were very precise and had existed ever since the occupation of the country of the Aztecs. These are the same topics that he brings back in his ethnological notebooks. So suddenly, we see Marx quote Nahuatl, and he quotes 6 or 7 different chroniclers of the conquest of ancient Mexico, Tenochtitlan. I mean, my question is, who here knew about Marx talking about Tlatelolco? You see, but we all spent every commemoration of the Paris Commune rereading the Civil War So the land's called Altepetlali, or Altepetl means pueblo, or city-state would be the Eurocentric translation. That is, those of the community of cities and villages, they were divided into as many parts as there were districts in a city, and every district possessed its own part, entirely distinct from and independent of every other. These lands could not be alienated by any means whatever. This is, of course, for the conquerors what makes them barbaric, because they have no understanding of private property. And therefore, they're also, according to the Bible, ready for the taking, because they are not taking care of God's creature, which is the land. So Marx annotates from Morgan, ancient society, commune tenure of lands, life in large household composed of a number of related families. This is the unit that he's talking about, the calpulli. And reasons for believing that they practiced communism in living in the household. If we now, and I'm coming to the conclusion, if we now look at the late Marx, the same passage that was discussed 2 weeks ago from the letter to Zazulich actually talks about Louis Morgan's Ancient Society, which he read because Maxim Kovalevsky gave him the gift of the book in 1877. These are the same manuscripts that Garcia Linera is translating in Bolivia. And so he's trying to understand this, and he reads this American writer who's supported in his work by the Washington government, is not at all to be suspected of revolutionary tendencies, says that the new system to which modern society is tending will be a revival in superior form of an archaic social type. We should not then be too frightened by the word archaic. This is what I'm trying to suggest, that this is not just an announcement of the Paris Commune or even the Russian Revolution, which is how Shannon and others will read those letters, the drafts and letter to Vera Zazulich. If we go back now to directly to what Morgan himself wrote in Ancient Society, he had actually used a very different formulation, because Marx in his annotations is not a very good like MLA or Chicago style manual quoter. Democracy and government, brotherhood and society, equality and rights and privilege and universal education foreshadow the next higher plane of society to which experience, intelligence, and knowledge are steadily tending. It will be a revival in a higher form of the liberty, equality, and fraternity of the ancient gentes, or clans. So it will be a return under the conditions of the French Revolution of that ancient understanding of the democratic system of governance that Morgan understands might have existed also not only in the Iroquois, but also in the Aztec Confederacy. In that newspaper that I quoted at the beginning, La Comuna, in 1874, they say something similar, and they announce what will happen 20 years later, which is the revolution and the so-called Commune of Morelos under Emiliano Zapata. We know, the editors say, that the state of Morelos is going to take a major step forward, and this shows us that communist principles are not exotic in our country. They are not a foreign imposed idea. An attempt is being made to pass a law declaring all uncultivated land property of the state, to use it in favor of the working class. Proposals of this kind do not need praise, since no one hides the fact that it is a crime for the rich to own large tracts of lands for mere luxury, when industry and the arts may want to lay claim to them to make them productive for humanity. Now, if anybody remembers a book that hopefully more people here will have read, John Womack's classic book on the Mexican Revolution, Emiliano Zapata, the opening scene is the scene where in September of 1909, Emiliano Zapata is elected calpulec of Anenequilco, namely the leader of what is still being lived as the calpulli of Anenequilco, of which he is the leader, or calpulec. When he was the first time there was a younger person, not an elderly, and when he was chosen, he was given a tin can with the so-called papeles primordiales, the primordial papers of the land of Anenequilco. Many of those were maps and texts written in Nahuatl. Emiliano Zapata did not read Nahuatl, so he went to Tepoztlan and asked the Christian priest to translate from the Nahua into Spanish. And Jesus Sotelo Inclán became friends with Francisco Franco, the closest friend of Emiliano Zapata after he was assassinated. And gained access to those documents, which are now partly in the Archivo General de la Nación and partly, this is the word on the street, in the personal private collection of Carlos Slim. And he traces all the leaders of the calpulli throughout 400 years. And he concludes by saying that the different mentions of these calpuleques of Anenecuilco are so many links in a long chain that perhaps knew no interruption while traversing several centuries. If from the remotest past onward they form a straight line that reaches all the way to Emiliano Zapata, we have reason to say that he too was a calpuleque. Let me just give you 2 examples of what that might mean. I mentioned before that Alonso de Zorita, the auditor of, in the 16th century, who was studying the character of the calpulli, he also collected all these new laws for the Indies. One of them says, the ley primera, first law, that the audiences should be, let me see if I have it here in direct translation, that they should make sure that there's information and that they provide for ways for the peoples, the pueblos, the villages, the towns, the communities that do not have ejidos, communal lands, that, or plots of land, that they need to get some without any prejudice to anybody else, without any damage to somebody else. And then in the second law, that the mountains, the pastures, and the waters should be held in common, and that there must be justice imparted between the parts among whoever has access to those common lands. In the agrarian laws of the so-called Morelos Commune between 1914 and 1915, we get almost the exact same laws that are being reused by the historic first Zapatistas. That to the communities and individuals, the terrains, mountains, and waters must be restored, from which they were, that were stolen from them. That they need to go back to any title that they have in their possession from before 1856, the confiscation of land ownership, whereby under the excuse of confiscating church property, the Mexican state actually confiscated a lot of these communal lands. These are the same land titles that Emiliano Zapata was given in that tin box when he became the leader of the calpulli. And this is why Ricardo Flores Magón, who would set up, according to some interpreters, another commune, and he's of course the main inspiration for Voltairine de Cleyre's celebration of the Mexican Commune in Mother Earth from an anarcho-communist perspective, why Ricardo Flores Magón can also say, it is clear then that the Mexican people are capable of achieving communism because they have practiced it, at least in part, for centuries. And that explains why, even though the majority of them are illiterate, they understand that it is better to take possession of the land than to take part in electoral farces to elevate executioners. And they are taking the land to the great outrage of the thieving bourgeoisie. And this is why Voltairine de Cleyre, shortly before she died from meningitis, that she was able to say that only in Mexico and to some extent in China, the fire of the commune was still being kept alive. And that's why she was able to sort of tap in my view, not with the same kind of possible connections that Marx certainly had, all the way going back to his writings and notebooks from the 1850s, in the tradition of this other communal tradition, in connection to which the Paris Commune becomes kind of a belated and minor phenomenon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruno, for that remarkable presentation, copious and erudite, and putting so much more on the table for us. I had some questions, but I think I want to go straight to the most important one, which in a way has to do with kind of the political work that it does to reread the commune in this way. I take it that, as you suggest, Marx kind of explicitly rejected the comparisons and explicitly wrote, that it was mistaken for a reproduction of the medieval communes. This is on page 211 of my copy, and that he spends a day, a page, a full page, trying to support this idea that it is a completely new historical creation. It's not an accident in a way, right? It's not that he was blind. He did it on purpose, and it's a well-articulated argument. And so I'm wondering what strategically it does to maintain it as a new form, a new creation. But also on the flip side, what does it do strategically, in your case, to show the continuities? Now, it's not as if, and the fact that actually the French Commune was just an epiphenomenon, it's not as if Marx ignored the strategic value of showing continuity, right? In fact, when you think about the famous expression, right? Welcome back, old mole, from where he appropriates Hamlet. The idea, of course, is that the revolutionary efforts kind of have been going on for a long time and come back up and crop up and then get repressed. And in a way, that notion of the old mole is kind of what what it seems to me that's the strategic value of your reading here. Question, of course, what is the strategic value of your reading? But I take it that the strategic value of what you're suggesting is that, no, in fact, there's a history, 500-year history of these efforts at communal forms of government and property, and that there's a benefit to actually tracing the histories and making it go back. And when he said, "Well done, old mole," I think it was in part to suggest that, yeah, there is a strategy to this, to believing that revolutionary forces continue over time, and when they get crushed, they will come back, which of course is the constant theme of his writing, right? The constant theme of his writing in 48 and 51 and in 71 as well. And it's how the essay ends, right? It will be, it's a glorious harbinger of a new society, but the idea is, it will return. It will return. Now, to a certain extent, I understand the strategy of those, for instance, in Morelos, when you read that section from En Morelos, the strategy there was very much a strategy of suggesting that, no, communism is homegrown, and it's lasted for a long time, and you don't have to look outside, right? They say communist principles are not exotic, right? Not internally imposed. And that, of course, is another very strategic move that you see all the time, which is to suggest that, no, this isn't coming from, Paris. It's homegrown, right? And it has a lot more power because of that, because it's homegrown. So I think I wanted to start there. I've got some other questions. I do want to also in our discussion turn to Voltairine de Cleyre's arguments, which I thought were interesting, about her critique of the commune as not having been sufficiently communist, her particular more anarchist views, her critique about the Banque de France and stuff like that, but maybe we can get to that later. I think the real question right now is kind of what is the, what was Marx doing intentionally, putting that aside, from a strategic perspective? What work does it do from a strategic perspective to take your corpus and to adopt your reading. And yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, I thought it was a strange, I mean, the whole, like, 3 drafts are sort of full of fits and starts, where he goes over similar arguments and rephrases them and stresses some more than others. And I thought this passage that you just quoted, when he says, you know, it's not the same as the old forms, is generally the fate of completely new historical creations to be mistaken for the counterpart of older and even defunct forms of social life, to which they may bear a certain likeness. Thus, the new commune, which breaks the modern state power, has been mistaken for a reproduction of the medieval communes, which first preceded and afterwards became the substratum of that very state power. So the first comment that I would make is that he goes on to delineate other mistaken interpretations of the Paris Commune. Many interpretations that are still quite often associated with Marx himself, because he's talking in terms of the subjunctive, the would. The commune would have done this, and he's suggesting actually it didn't do that, according to him. The communal constitution had been mistaken for an attempt to break up into a federation of small states. We saw Kristen Ross uses that interpretation. The antagonism of the commune against the state power has been mistaken for an exaggerated form of the ancient struggle against over-centralization. The commune constitution would have restored to the social body all the forces hitherto absorbed by the state parasite, feeding upon and clogging the free movement of society. That too, even in Lenin, will become one way of reading, and maybe we'll come to this, the commune, not so much as the commune is the revolution against the state as such, but it's a new kind of state in which it's no longer a parasitical excrescence, but those functions that now live high above and separated from society are reabsorbed into society. Here, he also suggests that that's a misunderstanding. So I'm fascinated by this paragraph in which Marx seems to narrow down the definition of what would count as the innovation, the newness of the historical creation of the commune, while, you know, just a page later, he says, the multiplicity of interpretations to which the commune has been subjected and the multiplicity of interests which construed it in their favor show that it was a thoroughly expansive political form, while all previous forms of government had been emphatically repressive. So now, because we see this wide variety, also the fact that we had Proudhonians and we had Blanquists and we had Bakunians, and we had very few Marxists and members of the First International on the barricades, you know, shoulder to shoulder. So it was a thoroughly expansive political form. Then why narrowing it down? So that would be my first question. I'm more on the side of opening it up, because once we start asking the question, what really counts as the commune for Marx, we're becoming Marxologists, and I have little interest in that. But there is a substantial answer, which is not just this tension between the narrowing of the definition and the expansiveness of it, which is that why does Marx reject the comparison with the medieval communes? And he says very clearly that the medieval communes, which first preceded and afterwards became the substratum of that very state power. So this is the interpretation that you get from Marx's articles in Revolutionary Spain, which I vividly recommend. Interestingly enough, everybody talking about Asiatic mode of production and Oriental forms of government also forget that the first time that Marx uses those two terms is to talk about Spain in those texts. And I have to thank my student, Becker Seguin, for reminding me of that. He has worked quite a bit on this text. The interpretation that Marx gives is that the comunidades, those uprisings of the communities in 1520, 1521 in Spain, they basically want to protect the new privileges of the rising bourgeoisie against absolute monarchy. And therefore, they paved the way for the installation of the modern bourgeois state. This is why he says they first proceeded and afterwards became the substratum of that very state power. So he does not want to make that link because the strategic value of the medieval communes is the absolute opposite of what he wants to see accomplished through the Paris Commune, which is, whether in one reading, the demolition of the smashing of the state apparatus, or in the other one, the absorption of its functions into the realm of civil society, and where all the public functions are managed with reason and transparency by the people themselves. So this is why historically he stays clear of that interpretation, which is of course still a very linear interpretation of history, which is at the same time beginning to question. And this was mentioned 2 weeks ago, but it's also a common understanding in many commentaries, including in Kristen Ross, that the focus on non-Western formations would happen after the text on the Paris Commune. But of course, Marx had already started learning Russian because he wanted to have a dialogue with the Russian populists to understand questions about land ownership, the agrarian commune, all the topics that Vera Sasulic will interrogate him about, and about which he hesitates a great deal. Just like here in these texts, I think we need to compare those fragments about the medieval communes with the fragments about the peasants. And is there unity possible between the peasantry in France and the Paris Commune in the capital? If it is going to spread to even the smallest village hamlet, then there needs to be a class alliance between the peasants and the working men and women in Paris. And Marx is also very clear about that in this text, how that could happen. And that the Paris Commune will also mean the liberation of the peasantry from the yoke of the usurers and the priests and the tax collectors and so on, that now weigh like an incubus on the chest of all the poor peasants in France, including in southern France, where we had seen in Marseille and Toulouse and in Bordeaux short-lived experiments in communal uprising as well. So I'm interested in not deciding this question once and for all. Can we make these continuities? I see the point that there are political and strategic advantages, not just analytical or historical, to doing it, either with a discontinuity or with a continuity. For me, looking at the larger picture, and of course I was provoking when I said Paris becomes an epiphenomenon, just like many of the theses are a provocation to sort of like shake our existing lethargy a little bit around continuously ignoring this vast set of historical experiences, but also the production of intelligibility about those historical experiences in so-called non-Western contexts.
So, yeah, so it's fascinating. And I don't want to be misunderstood here as in any way defending Marx. So I'm not here to defend Marx, particularly against the charge of essentially Eurocentrism readings and reception. Perhaps to crystallize the point then, one could say, he was talking to the International Working Men's Association. So he was talking to a group of workers in a revolutionary working persons association. And so in that sense, it may have been strategically important to emphasize what he saw as a unique element here, which was that the commune was, in his terms, the first workers' form of self-governance, right? And so in that famous passage where he says, its true secret was this, it was essentially a working class government the produce of the struggle of the producing against the appropriating class, the political form at least discovered under which to work out the economical emancipation of labor. Now, so what would that be doing? That would be, in a sense, strategically trying to give a model, right, for his audience and for his revolutionary working person audience of a successful moment where there is self-government by workers. And of course, workers, and this is, you know, familiar to everyone. I mean, the proletariat is a historical production that is a historical construct that arrives at a certain point in time that only exists in the 19th century, that did not exist before, right? And he insists on that, even though there are parallels and similarities and continuities between the proletariat, which arises, is created, and is born in the 19th century, and slave labor going back to antiquity, right? The point is that there's a historical determination of when the proletariat was born. And in a way, this is then the argument that here was the moment, right, where all of a sudden this idea that he articulated in 1848 comes alive as a possibility. Now, so then this doesn't mean that it's false, right, or that it's purely rhetorical or purely ideological, and that in fact to claim that it's new in one respect doesn't mean that it's not also old in another respect. So it's not a question that he's lying or falsifying facts in any way. It can be both. So it can be both new as a form of self-government of the proletariat, in part because the proletariat didn't exist before the 19th century, but also it can also be continuous to the archaic forms of commune, which then become important when he's in another conversation with another audience, which is the Russian audience, I take it, and others, but particularly with Zazulich, right? And that's the same way in which one could say strategically that one could argue in the Mexican context that we could say, well, communism is homegrown in some ways. But that doesn't mean that one couldn't also say that even in the Mexican context, there was something new, there would have been something new about it in 1911 or when there was a revolutionary forum, in part because the working class didn't exist before that. And so insofar as, and although I'm not an expert by any means, so it might not have been a working class movement as much as an agrarian reform, et cetera. So query all of that. But I think you can see the way in which one can have two valid, truthful, or I don't want to use the word, factually correct interpretations that do different work because of the audience that it's geared to, or because of the context in which it's spoken. Now, I don't know. That doesn't then absolve Marx of the critique, I don't think. But it suggests one strategic reading, I suppose. No?
Yeah, I think I like, and I think it's very important to draw attention to both the audience and the strategic use of the interpretation for a particular audience and a particular political purpose. So I think that's a very good explanation for why there is this sort of emphasis on the urban workers, because of course, talking about working class is, as you pointed out, and you raised these questions about, can we call the Mexican Revolution working class revolution? And of course, well, the people leading the revolution are workers. They work the land. So yes, they're the working class. They're not the urban industrialized working class. And of course, from an orthodox Marxist perspective, which is what Adolfo Gili adopts in his book, the first edition, especially in 1971, written from prison in Lecumberri, that is the very question. It cannot be a true commune unless we have the industrialized workers of the sugar plants involved in it, because the peasants, as sometimes Marx suggests also in the Civil War in France, we have the rurals that sort of overshadows the potential revolutionary role that the peasants might play if the Paris Commune as expansive form were to spread not only through the rest of France but through other countries. And Marx suggests that there might be an alliance, and somebody like Gili will use that explicitly in his interpretation of the Morelos Commune, saying, yes, we did have a proletarianized, impoverished peasantry, and they were already part or allied with the workers on the sugar plants, on the sugar plantations and factories in Morelos especially. And therefore, we did have this type of alliance that made it a proletarian revolution. Again, this is where the slippage happens between trying to stay within the orthodoxy of what counts as a properly Marxist interpretation, and what do we need in order to address the new audience, the others, and the new strategies in these other contexts, which would be, for example, the long history that I was trying to draw from Mexico. So, yeah, I think that's, I would completely agree with that. I was also not trying to, I may have to clarify that, I was not trying to accuse or criticize Marx for being Eurocentric. I actually think that we all know, of course, that there is an evolution in Marxist thinking, including in Marx and Engels especially, their interpretation of colonialism, and Engels' statements about the U.S. intervention in Mexico, is accompanied by some of the most racist comments that you can find. Marx indulged in some of that as well in the 1850s. So we know that there is this that the claim of Eurocentric Marx doesn't really hold up if you look at the larger trajectory. So my point was not to join that chorus of critics that accuse Marx of Eurocentrism. It's rather the other way around, that there is this incredible openness, this centrifugal openness towards an international perspective that, as I quoted in the first the epigraph, Marx devours everything that he gets his hands on to understand the nature and character of Western and non-Western, capitalist and pre-capitalist historical formations at the level of, the whole map of base and superstructure. And in a sense, when we look at the literature on Marx and Marxism, it is painfully narrowed down. We don't have that same openness, the same appetite for devouring all the books that crossed Marx's desk and that he devoured and spilled out in his notebooks, very often copying the exact same length of every chapter in Morgan's book. I mean, the chapter on the Aztec Confederacy is the same length as the chapter in Morgan's book. That's not a good summary or expose, but it does something clearly for Marx to basically take all of that down and digest it, and see what comes out of it when you put it in touch with other readings about military history, about the US intervention, about which he will write his journalistic essays, the history about Spain. And at every point he says, what do I need to read to understand that other problem, the longer history about the comuneros? And, I don't think there's many people, maybe one or two in this room, but maybe not even that have read all the volumes of the mega edition of Marx. But even when we focus on our select few favorite texts, it is much narrower and much more inward-looking than Marx's own method. And so I find elements of this openness, of this, there's sort of threats thrown into the address to the workers, the First International, that sort of open paths to himself and to the audience, including the peasants, that longer history, other communes, previous forms of the communes. And then, what does it mean to talk about the commune as form? An expansive political form. When does something start qualifying as form? The question that I've had most often about this whole project about the Mexican commune is, what are your criteria to call something a commune? And then we're in the phase of taxonomies. And I am, very ecumenical. I can sleep in, some people accuse me of not having stronger lines of division, and speaking with too many people that shouldn't be our friends. But in commune, commons, communalization, communism, socialism, the appetite for taxonomical divisions to sort of say, I am working on the common, and I do not agree with the people that talk about the communes, and then you give your stipulations. How can we capture the expansiveness of the commune form? What would that require in terms of methods, in reading and approaching and unpacking what is here, and pulling on those threads that Marx throws in there, sometimes as notes to self, particularly obviously in the notebooks, where he mixes all these things, including doesn't even take the time to translate everything, which is another sort of fascinating part, that he's interjecting his German and the abbreviations and the whole, the way of working. I think, that I think is worthy of imitation, because it's a outward-looking, conjunctural hunger for continuing to expand our understanding of world historical movements.
Terrific. Thanks, Bruno. So let's turn then to the two other texts that you put on the table, both fascinating, starting with Voltairine de Cleyre's text, titled The Commune is Risen, published in 1912, and by a remarkable anarchist thinker, also an abolitionist, actually. She was, there was an assassination attempt on her life by a student of hers who had mental difficulties, whereupon she really embraced abolitionism, said that the person should not be punished, was completely against any form of punishment for the student, etc. A remarkable woman, anarchist, writer, poet, in a form of a prose poem here almost. What do you think so tell us more, what do you think here, but here there's also a fascinating strategic move on her part, which is to both kind of embrace the commune as the model, shining future that is instantiated, she says, only now in Mexico, but also to criticize the commune pretty harshly. And so she has these critiques, right, that the reason that the commune fell was that the communards were not, in her words, communists, right? And so this picks up on a theme that is kind of current, related to the Civil War in France as well, having to do with the communards didn't take over the French Bank of France, which would have been, which was located in Paris, so they could have, but they felt it was the property of all of France and not simply of Paris and of their commune, so they never took it over, and there's been a lot of debate about, whether that might have shifted or changed the outcome, et cetera. But she definitely takes that position. In fact, she takes the position that they weren't sufficiently for the abolition of property, in a sense. They attempted to break political chains without breaking economic ones, and it cannot be done. And so there is in here both a valorization and at the same time this sharp critique. And the sharp critique fits nicely, I think, with her anarchism and her particular view of the state. She writes that because making war upon the state, she, the commune, had not made war upon that which creates the state, that to preserve which the state exists. I take it by which she means property. It's a little bit like Fred Moten and Harney when they speak about an abolitionist world, not a world that just abolishes, but a world that makes it impossible to imagine the production of a prison or something like that. So what do you think that she's doing? What do you think that she's doing strategically in the same way in which, right, we've been talking about the way in which, what was Marx doing strategically in his text, and what are you doing strategically in your reading? What do you think she was doing in her text?
Yeah, I think I've tried to look into that a little bit, like the context in which this text is appearing. So Mother Earth, Emma Goldman, Voltairine de Cleyre, and others, William C. Owen, they were very close to the Magonistas in California, but also clearly received text. So in the same issue of Mother Earth, after this this piece, let's call it a prose poem about the commune, we get a publication, the translation of the Manifesto of the Mexican Revolution. This is at least how it described itself, which is the text of the 23 de septiembre, the 23rd of September 1911, a famous manifesto that appeared in Regeneración in the Magonista newsletter from 1911. It's a little bit of an exaggeration to claim that this is the manifesto of the Mexican Revolution. If you look at the documents about Zapatismo or Villismo, you will not find these texts. They were not organically linked to the Mexican Revolution. Most of them were in the US or in prison in the US. So the Mexican Liberal Party is very often associated as a precursor or an anarchist sort of ally of the Mexican Revolution. And they arrogated to themselves some of the importance of having founded or having written a manifesto of the Mexican Revolution. And in many of the issues of Mother Earth, you will get US poets and writers analyzing from the data that they are getting from Morelos and elsewhere, also Yucatan, where it had a socialist governor later on, what they can to describe this this idea of Zapata land, right, which contains some of the same texts. If anybody's interested, send me an email. I can send you a PDF of this pamphlet. There's also an amazing set of articles that try to portray. It's called the Workers' World, I think, a portrait of Zapata. So what she's trying to do here is make that link that, as far as I know, nobody outside of Mexico had made, which is the link between the commune in Paris and what is going on in the Mexican Revolution. So this is one of the earliest statements that connects the Mexican Revolution already in 1911, 1912 with the form of the commune. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was as a teaser, also because it connects it to the US. This is why I sort of gave it as an additional reading. I was less sort of concerned about the critique about private property and more interested in the fact that she, as opposed to Marx, probably for the reasons that you point out, which is his audience obviously are the urban workers of Paris. She does link it to the question about agrarian reform and land ownership and food supply. That the Paris Commune was also faced by a problem which will forever face revolting cities with a terrible question mark, the problem of food supply. If you are in a besieged city, you know, the food chain will become a major issue. But then she, of course, says, never till the rebels of industrial fields have joined their forces with agrarian labor can industrial or political revolt be anything more than futile struggling for a temporary gain which will alter nothing. So she goes a step further, not just criticizing like Marx already did, not taking over the bank, not marching onto Versailles, the major criticism that Marx has also of the Paris Commune, the reasons for why it failed or was crushed, so because they allowed Versailles to reorganize and prepare the butchery. By the way, the famous butcher of the Paris Commune, Marquis de Galifet, where do you think he got his training? Algeria and in Mexico. So he was in Mexico and had to flee through Veracruz when Emperor Maximilian was shot in 1867. So it is almost as though he wagered, this is not going to happen, again to me. So the violence that, of the butchery of the Semaine Sanglante also has everything to do with the impact of, Galifet's presence in the colonies in Algeria, but also in Mexico. So I think this point about the unity between the rebels of industrial fields that need to join forces with agrarian labor, which is exactly how Adolfo Gili in his Trotskyist reading will interpret the Morelos Commune, is, I think, an innovative new step in her piece that brings it closer to not just a commune in an urban setting, but what happens in a country such as Mexico. Very much along the same lines of the questions that Zasulich will have for Marx in their correspondence.
Thanks, Bruno. Maybe before I open it up, so start getting ready to intervene. We just turned to the last text, which is the text by Plotino Rhodakanaty. This one seemed. Now, this one's much earlier, of course. It's 1877. A lot is happening in the United States at this time. And he references that in terms of Erie. I suppose he's referring to the railroad strikes. But of course, there's a lot else going on, including the demise of Reconstruction. But he's in Mexico. And I read this one as much more of a kind of drawing on the commune as a form of inspiration for others to rise up. Very early, though, right? Because, I mean, it's 6 years past. I suppose, I forget when Rodakanati was in Paris, meeting with Proudhon. I forget in what years that was. I think he goes to Mexico in 61?
61, yeah.
So this would be 16 years later. So it's not as if he's receiving the influence, or it's not as if he's immediately traveling from Paris at this point. Yeah. But it does seem like a more conventional kind of use of the commune as an inspirational force to try and mobilize, right?
Yeah. Well, as in many other countries, in Mexico, the newspapers reported very quickly, about a week after the event, so the telegrams had to arrive from very quickly about the events in Paris. And of course, the Catholic and conservative press was vehement against, the monsters and the boa constrictor that is, stifling and killing Paris. And Zasulich later on, will also be discussed in the newspapers in Paris. And so, to a large extent, Rodakanati is correcting that interpretation of the Paris Commune, reestablishing its credentials, its dignity. He remains a Fourierist, so he writes a fascinating sort of didactic pamphlet. He usually wrote in sort of either philosophical dialogues or didactic pamphlets that took the form of catechisms, questions and answers. And so he says, what is the superior form I didn't quote this, like that to which society is tending, and he calls it communalism. And he says, I want to distinguish communalism from communism. And this is where his criticism will come in, because communism wants to establish this free association right here and now, and that's not possible. We first have to have democratic rights according to the French Revolution, fraternity, equality, and so on. And we need to go, quietly, or sort of, we need to pace ourselves. And this is called Cartilla Socialista Republicano, so a socialist Republican primer. And he also tries to sort of set up a basic philosophy or history of the different stages through which humanity has passed, all the way from Edenism, which Badiou probably would mock as primitive, the cult of archaic societies and primitive communism, all the way to the future communalism, which we're on the path towards. But I thought that his eloquent summary of some of the interpretations of major events of the Paris Commune, the destruction of the column of the Vendôme, the role of the First International, even though he doesn't spell Karl Marx's name correctly, as you've seen, completely bastardizes the name. But then at the end, when he sort of evokes the infallible law of analogy, that providentially, because he remains, of course, a religious thinker, providentially, the commune will come back and will also happen here. There's sort of a necessary law to that, and then he uses the metaphors of the el fatídico búho, if anybody here knows what the metaphor would mean, the major specialist Carlos Illades, who's the top expert of Rodakanati, publishes also this text in an anthology, mistranscribes it, and it's something like bajo, which makes no sense. But it's basically the image of a bird that visits the sick person right before they die. And Rodakanati says this is what will happen with the despotic regime of the Porfiriato in Mexico, and we can already see this announced, that like a vulture or a bird that will land, the owl that will land on the sick person's hut, this despotic regime also will come to an end, and the commune will come back.
Great. Thank you, Bruno. All right, we're going to start with Hope. Let me pass you the mic.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. This was a really illuminating conversation. And I'm sorry if my thoughts are a little bit disjointed. I am consulting my notes. So it really stuck with me closer to the beginning of this discussion when you were talking about the way that the Western world and that Western Marxists and just people generally in that tradition conceived of the calpulli, this more Eurocentric and, if I'm being honest, self-consciously positioned European superiority, understanding that there is, again, according to them, a form of communism that is primitive and therefore not worth engaging with, the whole fissure between the humanitas and the anthropos. And I can't help thinking about the ways in which, even in these movement spaces, people continue to reproduce divisions amongst themselves. There's a sense of intellectual superiority, I think, that certain people who consider themselves leftists feel over people who are living these ideals but haven't necessarily read the theory, and who are actually bringing that commune spirit into a non-communist world, into a world of crisis, and their actions are discounted perhaps because they haven't engaged with the theory and are therefore seen as primitive and are therefore seen as the anthropos and not the humanitas. And I think that this is evident, pre-Russian Revolution era, when the sons of Russian nobles went to get educated in Western Europe, and then they came back and tried to paternalistically nurture these Marxist leanings in the peasants, or even how sometimes Columbia students try to go up into Harlem and engage in very similar paternalistic behavior of trying to tell Harlemites what they need. And so we have all of these people who consider themselves Marxist, Blanquist, Bakuninist, whatever, so on and so forth, who are still sowing these hierarchical divisions amongst themselves. And I'm wondering, like, why does this happen, and how can we stop this from happening? And then I'm so sorry for rambling, but you know, I'm also just thinking about this idea of revolutionary subjectivity, and this idea that I think a lot of people, especially people who run in intellectual circles and might consider themselves intellectuals, think that revolutionary subjectivities are derived from reading theory. And there are people who have read theory, like Rosa Luxemburg or Frantz Fanon, who seem to reject this because their ideas are kind of that it is the revolutionary action that inherently transforms subjectivities. And it's through that kind of action that we come to understand ourselves as revolutionary subjects and sustain momentum in our movements. And so I wonder why this cognitive dissonance remains for people. And then I also just wanted to mention one more thing, which is looking at the Humanitas Anthropos division through the perspective of disability. I think that disabled people are very often discounted in leftist circles, and our contributions aren't necessarily seen as valid when we've been creating spaces of care in which we, well, take care of ourselves as a collective, because the state certainly doesn't do it, and the private sector certainly will never conceive of us as true, real people and give us what we need, because it's not profitable to do that. And these spaces that are truly existing in that commune spirit and are carving out a niche for that commune in a world that lacks it aren't seen as valuable contributors to movements. And we even talked about how essential care work is when we were discussing feminism for the 99% earlier in the semester. And I'm also just wondering why this form of the spirit of the commune, of the spirit of the calpulli, is continuously discounted.
You want to take more, or you want to? No.
Well, why don't we start
Okay.
there, and then we'll take another round. You got a question?
Yeah, I have no answer to the question why does this cognitive dissonance continue. It's a fact of life, for me at least. And it just invites me to redouble the effort to be, in a sense, as ecumenical and as open as possible to different perspectives. That also means there is a certain joy or pleasure or that comes with adopting that position of theoretical superiority, which is you found your niche, you share a common jargon that you recognize, not just with your peers, but since this is an international phenomenon, that kind of theoretical understanding of things that go without saying, happens through translations everywhere. So we can have a conversation here about Marx, and people might be looking at it, or later on you might talk with a friend in South Korea or in Japan or in Chile, and you have the same reference points, because that's a shared theoretical debate that we have today. There's nothing wrong with that, but there is the movement of ensimismamiento, of turning inwards and looking and thriving only when you recognize the same discourse being repeated and recognized among a small group, leaving out these other perspectives, certainly plays on not only in social media and polarization in general, but also affects intellectual life and the production of knowledge. Unfortunately, that's an uneven development. And therefore, the burden will always fall on the peripheral areas to remark their particularity and to remind others that what they assume to be a universally shared discourse is not such, or is only one historical formation among others. And that's sort of an endless, Sisyphus labor, where the most common reaction is people's eyes glaze over when you start talking about, the things that they're not familiar with, which they also don't think they should familiarize themselves with because somebody so-and-so already said it better, either before or after in a Western European language.
Okay.
So
Thank
I don't really have an answer for that, but the generosity and the respect for and the curiosity for the scholarship on all levels. It doesn't have to be theoretical or even university scholarship. The work of thinking and writing. Many of these, like Jesus Sotelo Inclán, very modest, school teacher. It doesn't have to be elite, the most advanced vanguard of theoretical knowledge in what is now respected as the hot take on some forgotten manuscript of Marx.
Mm-hmm.
But to open oneself up to, the curiosity that somebody like Marx, and it doesn't always have to be going back to Marx, but that he certainly showed for the thinking that went on elsewhere. People have nice ideas about the equality of intelligences, and I think that requires that we also respect the fact that people are producing knowledge elsewhere, not just to read your work, because that's not a equality of intelligences, that you just listen to them because they're your disciples, but rather there are people thinking everywhere in the world, with or without university degrees, and it behooves us to learn from the knowledge that is being produced on a daily basis, and that crosses all genres. It doesn't have to be even theory or sociology or political science or philosophy. It can be literature, it can be art. And I'm not being flippant about it. I do believe that there is, I sort of told Bernard, don't say philosopher, I'm not a philosopher. Call me anything else, critical, literary critic, critical theorist, philologist, cultural, study scholar. But that also means that you treat those human products as expressions of their time, and therefore they are producing live the intelligibility of our situation.
Thanks, Bruno. The only thing I would add is that, I think it's worth valorizing or lifting up or reading and rereading and thinking about whole traditions that, whether they are in conversation with Marx or with other thinkers who kind of put pressure on that hope, and who struggle against that. And I think you can think of someone like Paulo Freire, for instance, right, as someone whose dedicated life mission was, in a sense, to reject those notions of theory and leading praxis, but actually that pedagogy itself, right, is a form of communication wherein the quote-unquote student actually has all the information, and it's not, and the relationships are flipped upside down. So I think it's worth reaching out to those traditions and working with those thinkers and practitioners. Augusto Baol also with the theater of the oppressed, et cetera, and various different disciplines are really important there to rethink those hierarchies and traditional ways of thinking. Thanks for raising that. Tessa?
Test. Yes.
It's working.
All right. Yeah, thank you for this conversation. My question is in regards to periodization and how the sort of history you've laid out for us, the Hispanic transatlantic tradition, how this complicates standard Marxist periodization, what this means for periodization. Is it useful? Is it possible at all? Yeah.
Okay, good. You want to hold off for a second? We got another question here, and then we'll have you answer both, or three.
Thank you for your intervention. I'm just trying to make sense of like the broader gesture, and I think I'm going to ask a question where your answer can just be no, and would require nothing more. Would it be fair to think of your project largely as an act of distension, where like you find something to be distended, right? So if you look at all the previous attempts as applying lenses that produce images, and the image that you end up reproducing is the image of the proximate, right? Either your proximity to a certain group of texts, a certain group of people, a certain region, and the lens that you seem to be applying is that of a distension, or let's say a bloating, or, well, malforming of that existing relation to something that is unfamiliar. Therefore, what seems to be, for Marx, a fundamentally novel, distinct historical moment now becomes distended in the form of being continuous in a far longer periodization of history. Well, don't want to use periodization, subject to whatever you say to that. A longer trajectory of history on the one hand, and second, if you're looking of a discontinuous Europe on the other hand, you're looking at locations from elsewhere, maybe even earlier periods, let's say like peasant insurgencies in India, which are also like revolutionary forms and moments that happen, a sort of broader trajectory. So is it that we're conceiving of a praxis that is based on non-proximity, let's not call it unfamiliar or strangeness, but that sort of distends proximity?
And we're going to add one more before we turn back to you, Bruno. Uzma?
Hi. This might be a really basic question, but I guess I was wondering about the relationship between the commune and class society. My Southern came out, class society. And I hope your question made me think about this. Even if you have, or like, if the workers who work the land own the land, there are other forms of care that can create class difference or caste or whatever. And so just wondering about that relationship.
Thank you. Bruno?
Yeah, so to the question about periodization, well, whether it's useful, I think that's for you to decide. Whether it's possible, I hope so, because sort of the history is written. So whether it's a flight of fancy or a complete distension that leads to like complete absurdity and nonsense of you can't put X and Y together in that way. Again, that would be for the reader or for the interlocutors to decide. But I like that image, and I'm not sure like what the field reference for that metaphor of distension is. If it's like cataracts, this desprendimiento, like how do you say it? Your cornea. How do you call it? When you
Iris? Is
it sort of
iris? No.
It breaks off or whatever. Sorry? Yeah, that doesn't help me either. I mean, no medical terms, but I think it has something to do with contrasted or polemical forms of reading. I like to think, and people don't like that, but I like to think polemically against what I'm reading or writing. And I'm fine with getting that treatment back, because I think that's sort of the testing of breaking down the hierarchies. So the first question is hopefully also a result of doing this type of polemical reading. When you read something, and what if what you're reading, and it doesn't really matter if it's Marx or some other writer or poet, what if this person or this point of view is completely wrong, And how would I argue against this, or juxtaposing it with something that you're reading at the same time in a completely different discipline, and suddenly you produce a short circuit. This is very much also what, you know, Slavoj Žižek would call his own approach. You cause a short circuit between high-flying German idealist philosophy and vulgar popular culture. And you make them work against one another. And that means you're breaking down already the barriers between certain respectable disciplines. But second, and more importantly, you're conceptually mobilizing your own thought against itself. And that, you know, in this case, you sort of look at these different areas of discussion that have no interaction. They do not talk to one another. They will meet, maybe, or they read one another. All the Mexican historians and anthropologists in the INA, Instituto Nacional de Antropología y la Historia, they were, of course, reading what the French Marxists were publishing in Spanish translation. That did not go the other direction. Nobody had even an idea about what was going on in Mexico and in France, right? And it's that uneven development of knowledge that I'm trying to break down. And yes, it goes through a certain periodization that tries to broaden the horizon or break down the narrowness of certain stale interpretations, and at the same time distending or opening up room for a different approach. If on top of that you can use reflections, I mean, in recent months, you know, whether it's Roque Dalton about the state of insurrection today in his Un Libro Rojo para Lenin. Also because if you look at, I'm a Latin Americanist, so I focus much of my teaching and research on Latin America as sort of one area, and then there's the whole question about theory and philosophy. Again, they very often don't communicate, but if you put one against the other, sort of flashes appear, because then there's the asynchronicity of these texts. Suddenly, when everybody says we're no longer discussing Marx, let's say 1980s France, 1990s, everybody is doing some other stuff, until like the revival of, you know, let's all go back to Althusser, or the Althusserians suddenly become fashionable, even though they have been working for 20 years in complete isolation. So that's how the development of ideas happens there, but there's a different trajectory, a different periodization elsewhere, where suddenly Garcia Linera may be reading the same text about Sasulich and the late Marx in the mid-1990s in prison. And so there is no easy way of putting these traditions in dialogue, because they don't share the same presuppositions, they don't share the same time frame, and their strategic choices are different. What happens if you try to put one against the other? Even by saying, I'm not going to respect the open polemical attitude. For example, I have good friends that are rabid anti-Althusserians, and you can tell them, I'm going to read you in dialogue with the person that you hate the most, because I'm going to show that you're actually saying the same thing, right? Or, you know, you can say Hegelians and Kantians, or, you know, humanists and anti-humanists. And that doesn't mean that you make it a free-for-all, that everything is valid and everything is relative. It's actually, you need to keep also the polemical edge of all those traditions, and that is, if you insert them into one another, that's the cutting edge where you actually test the validity of your arguments, and you produce something new, and in that short circuit. So I think that kind of, whether, you know, maybe it doesn't answer the last question about commune and class society. Again, I don't work as much along the lines of contrasting or putting in dialogue class and caste, but I know that this is a very important orientation today in a lot of discussions. So I respect that, but it's not where I am, you know, sort of thinking right now. So So I don't really have an answer to that. Sorry.
All right. Thank you, Bruno, and thanks for your generosity in addressing all these questions. Maybe we can conclude then with one last question, maybe, or give you an opportunity to elaborate on your work and on the book that will be coming out, the Mexican Commune, that will be coming out with Duke University Press. In the second part, I mean, we have the beginning of the second part, but the beginning of the second part seems to suggest more, and so I thought maybe you could finish by giving us at least an aperçu of where you're going, because you seem to be very focused. It seems as if this is going to push you towards certain hypotheses for an articulation between the notion of commune and the notion of community. So maybe we could end there with some tantalizing ideas for us as to what to expect from the book, or what to expect from that work that ties commune to community.
Yeah, I mean, roughly the second part, which is like Marx in Mexico, Mexico in Marx, is sort of, it could have been an appendix, it could have been a separate book, it could not have been part of this book. It's basically written with friends in mind, some of them are here, who will probably appreciate that, even though others may not have much time for the first part, which is the more focused on Mexico. So in the second part, I try to offer what would the new angle be on Marx and Marxism if we take into account this broader periodization of a transatlantic comunero tradition that is much longer and that Marx was tapping into in regular intervals in his notebooks and in his writing. What does that do for our understanding of Marx and Marxism? That's in a sense the attempt in the thesis on Marx are a summary of the methodological conclusions that I drew from that part, from the second part. The first part tries to tell that story, fragments of a story of the other commune, of the commune in Mexico, and I preface that with a long engagement again of how to write a history of rebellion and revolt today. And we didn't talk about this, but I had sort of prepared a little bit the tensions in Marxist text between the reading of the commune as a revolution against the state and the reading of the commune that would say this is an attempt to form like a non-state state. Like all the stuff about absorbing the public functions back into society, as opposed to when he says this is not a revolution against this or that legitimate constitutional republican or imperialist form of state power. It was a revolution against the state itself. Right? This is, to me, the political situation in which we find ourselves today, which is both on the left and the right, a knee-jerk anti-statism that leaves very little room for politics other than short-lived protests and insurrections. That's why the new book is about Latin American Marxism, will tell the story of how we've come to this point under the title The State and Insurrection. It's no longer the state and revolution, it's a state and insurrection as non-dialectical opposite, or what Marx calls real extreme opposites that have no desire to be mediated by the other. We see that within universities today, we see that in the US today, we see it, the onslaught on the state. But after 40 years where the left had themselves engaged in quite vehement anti-statism, or what one Latin American thinker calls metaphysical anti-statism. And so in the long introduction to the book on the Mexican Commune, I tried to sort of find a a point of entry for why would we even go into this periodization? Why care about this? At the time, we were in the midst of the accusations and the so-called official version about the 43 disappeared students of the Teachers College, the Rural Teachers College in Ayotzinapa. And of course, there was international outrage about those disappeared students. But I thought that a lot of these debates were also trapped in a moralizing accusation of, fue el Estado, it was the state. The state is always the culprit. Here in the university, it's the big bad administration, low library. And that creates what the first question asked about revolutionary subjectivity. It creates the free spirit of the person who is anti-institution. Working in the institution, but anti-institution. The free spirit, the smiling student, comme bandit in front of CRS, the riot police in France, on the cover of the other side of the reverse side of psychoanalysis about shame. So the shamelessness of that anti-institutional, more anarchist orientation, that's where we are right now. So in the introduction to the book, I tried to suggest what happens if we start from a point of view where we are not aggrieved in the first place, because we are in a situation where everybody is aggrieved. And so the politics of grievances, states of injury, Wendy Brown's book, and a few weeks ago, Grant Ferret from Cornell University published a little book in form of thesis on grievance, saying this entire country from the Declaration of Independence is based on grievances of aggrieved identities. Somebody else is always the culprit of one's own suffering. And so I start this with a reflection on how can we write a political history in a different modality that is not the melodramatic modality of the accusation of the big bad institutions, state and its apparatuses, but rather from the point of view of the subjective rebellions that are underlying all the repression. Why were they targeted in the first place? Not just even the question about did they get involved in a mistaken identity among drug gangs, but rather what was the story? What's the story behind those teacher colleges? That was part of the socialist education. Under Lázaro Cárdenas, public education became socialist. And so they always talk about being on the side of the people, making the people, and take the side of the people. And they had targeted these colleges, just like they had targeted the 1917 Constitution that made the commons of the subsoil still nationalized, also under Cárdenas. So there are these longer histories that explain that if we look beyond the moral outrage and the accusations against existing state apparatuses, we are in the presence of collective acts of rebellion. And can we go back to that? Can we write the history of Mexico from the point of view of the acts of rebellion? And therefore, this underground history of communal revolts that has a much longer perspective. And that's what I was trying to do in the book.
Great. Thank you so much, Bruno. And thank you, everyone, for being here. This is the last 1313 here in New York. There will be another 1313 in Paris on May 27th, I think it is, with Etienne Baribao, that will be wrapping up the series. We're also possibly, I'm trying to line up Jeremy Kessler to do a keynote on Pashukanis and his relationship to Marx, possibly next Wednesday, if not sometime shortly thereafter. So thank you very much, and let's continue the conversation at Arts and Crafts, okay? And thanks for being here.